It's 25 minutes after the hour. It's a therapeutic Thursday, and you know what that means.
What does that mean?
Pastor Robbie Pruitt joins us.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's okay.
David, you and I and all the listeners together this morning will learn something. So listen up, people. We're going to be talking parables again today. Matthew 13, if you have your Bibles here. Robbie, an Anglican pastor. His church is in Fairfax, Virginia. He lives in Ashburn, just outside the nation's capital. And he is one of the busiest and most giving people I know. How's the bicycle ministry doing?
Good to be with you, Jim and David, on the Broken Road. A pleasure as always. Thanks so much for asking. Bike ministry is going great. We had about 8 teenagers come by the house on Monday, pick up 6 different bikes. I had 5 different volunteers. And what's scheduled from 2 to 5 sometimes goes into 6 and 7 o'clock at night. We've gotten to call it bike church.
Now you get bikes donated to you, and you repair them, and then you give them away, right?
That's right. Yeah, we get free donations of broken bicycles. We fix them up, find them a new home. Sometimes the bikes aren't really broke. They're just, people have outgrown them, and we find someone without a bicycle and give them one. So
Robbie's the only Anglican pastor I know who's really good with a wrench.
And it's funny, you called this Therapeutic Thursday. I don't know if it's, I've never been accused of being a therapeutic voice. Maybe you need therapy after you listen to me. I'm not too sure.
Well, yeah. Robbie, last week we were talking about Matthew 13 and the agrarian nature, the agrarian village nature of people that he's addressing. Jesus is in Capernaum on the shore of Galilee. And in this case, the crowd was too big, so he took a boat and went out on the boat so he could address the crowd. I never thought of that as actually amplifying his voice as well, because oftentimes I picture him talking to hundreds or thousands of people. Did he have to yell? I mean, that would be strange. I noticed that on the Chosen, when he was on the Sermon on the Mount, his disciples dispersed themselves in the crowd and relayed what he said to explain that.
Yeah.
And that may have been, I don't know what actually happened, but that would be a practical solution to me. But when you got a lake around, you got water, you can hear a long distance. And not that he was 100 yards out. He was probably in water just deep enough to float the boat. But he could address a large crowd that way and be heard. And he used references. In fact, noting about Matthew 13, this is an occasion, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jesus is using parables to teach spiritual truth, because that's what parables do. They're earthly stories with spiritual significance. So he is teaching with parables. He's also teaching about parables, because Matthew has included the portion where his disciples come to him and say, "Why are you doing this? Why are you talking in parables?" And he explains, because they would not, I'm paraphrasing him now, they would not understand if I gave them the straight spiritual aspects of this, because they don't have ears to hear that, but they can understand a parable and relate that to the core of the message. That's why I speak to them in parables. I've always been confused about this phrase, and this is in chapter 13, verse 13. This is why I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. So I've always thought of that as backwards, like he's using parables so they wouldn't understand it, because they can't. It's just the inverse of that. He was using parables because they do understand, in this case, agrarian, farmer-oriented references.
Right. So parabola, to cast alongside of. So he's taking something like agriculture that everyone would be familiar with. He's casting alongside that a spiritual truth so that they would understand. Ironically, the way that chapter 12 ends is his family, Jesus' own family, not getting it, not understanding who he is, not understanding his teaching, coming to get him. It says that while he was still speaking to the people, behold, his mother and brother stood outside asking to speak with him. But he replied to the man who told him, "Who is my mother and brother?" And stretching out his hand towards his disciples, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers, for whoever does the will of my Father is my brother and my sister and mother." And then he tells the parable of the sower. right after his own family coming to visit. And we know that his own family had a disbelief not only in Capernaum when they came, but in Nazareth when he taught in the synagogues. Isn't this the carpenter's son? So yes, there's an understanding and a not understanding. And so Jesus is teaching in parables so that people will understand. It's a casting alongside of a spiritual truth to a natural reality. And so this is an agricultural society that understands sowing and reaping. And so he tells this parable of the sower. Also, we talked about last week, also a parable of the soils. And where he is, interestingly, our friends at BiblePlaces.com has put together a slideshow on the Gospel of Matthew, all of the Gospels, really. And here in chapter 13, they show you aerial footage of the Sea of Galilee, and there's what's called the Cove of the Sower. And this is almost like a watered amphitheater. So it's this half circle where people could gather. It looks almost like a theater, and a boat could go out. And because that cove is shaped the way it is, it's not only the flatness of the water that the sound waves are carrying over the water, but it's echoing along the shoreline there. And so it's the perfect place to teach, if indeed that was the place. Now, it is west of Capernaum, where Jesus makes his hometown with Peter's home across from the synagogue there in Galilee. So
There's not much left besides Peter's home and what's called the white synagogue there. It's a synagogue that was built later than Jesus' time, but it's still there, and it marks the same location of the synagogue where he taught as well, the original synagogue.
Right.
But
And we know
terrible.
that because of the basalt foundation, actually. The basalt stone is original to the first century, and that white marble that's on top of it from later that you're talking about.
The Byzantine, the later Roman
Yeah.
Empire. Yeah.
Yeah, that comes later, but it's on that basalt stone from the first century. And
Mm.
Capernaum, a lot of folks don't realize it, but Capernaum was a manufacturer of millstones. So the artifacts there, a lot of the artifacts are indeed millstones made out of the basalt stone, which is a volcanic rock, unlike the
Incidentally, in
limestone.
last week's podcast, it included photographs of that area, aerial photographs. So if you take a look at Robbie's podcast from a week ago, you'll see his pictures about that, and it's obvious that couldn't have been the whole scene at the time. It's a very small area.
Yeah.
And a much longer coastline where commercial activity, groups teaching, I don't know, people went to the beach and swam in Galilee, probably, but there was room for all that in that day and time.
Yeah, indeed. And he could have gone as far west as the Cove of the Sower that they've named there, and it would have been a perfect teaching platform. But he's quoting Isaiah. So he goes on, "This is why I speak to them in parables, because of seeing they do not see, hearing they do not hear." You pointed that out. Those are Jesus's words. And then he says, indeed, in their case, the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled. And then Isaiah is quoted here in Matthew in verses 14 and 15. "You will indeed hear, but never understand. You will indeed see, but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull. And with their ears, they can barely hear. With their eyes are closed, lest they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their heart and turn, and I would heal them." In other words, I want them to understand, because if they understand with their heart and turn, I would heal them.
But that was Isaiah writing
Yeah.
800 years previously,
That's right.
or maybe 700 years previously, and it was prophecy, and that he's validating now Isaiah was kind of like the chief prophet. He was the number one ranked prophet among the observant Jews. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, and one of the most Christological, because you have the suffering servant there in Isaiah 53. There are many prophecies that are fulfilled. It's a book that's quoted often by Jesus. I think the only other book that is quoted more is probably Deuteronomy and the Psalms.
And of course, he speaks to the law and has said that he's not there to change any of it, not a jot or a tittle. And so this is part of a great reset
Yeah.
to bring. We think of it as the kingdom of God, but it's the kingdom that was and has been covered over by centuries of heresy and confusion and disinformation and just life, I suppose. A
Mm.
succession of kings, a succession of empires, and the Jews are there now in the first century A.D. wondering about their origins. These people in the north, though, were a little better connected, weren't they? Because I think, as I understand the history, and Doug Greenwald of Preserving Bible Times has related this, that a lot of them were latecomers from Babylon captivity. They came like just around, just after the Maccabean revolt, around 140 BC or so, and came because they had certain prophetic comments that they took to heart, that the
Right.
Messiah would appear first in the north. And so that's where they tended to settle. And Nazareth was probably one of the towns that they founded after arriving from Babylon. And so Jesus is taught. These are a lot of hard-headed uh, mega types, if you forgive the reference. But it characterizes a very conservative thinking, observant Jews here who are holding to the testimony of Isaiah and other prophets. And
Right.
Jesus sometimes changes their thinking on those things.
Yeah.
Like
That
in
would be the
Nazareth.
first time that I've heard a MAGA reference made about first century Hebrews.
Mhm.
Congratulations.
Yeah, that's quite the feat, right?
Breaking new ground here. Yes.
Well,
Congratulations.
I think I made the point.
It's almost like it's kind of like Remez for our present age, because we can say MAGA and all of a sudden we understand everything that goes on around it.
Well, see,
Just like the ancient Hebrews did.
This explains the sudden turn of events at Nazareth when Jesus was teaching in that synagogue, because he read from the scrolls, he read from Isaiah, and he made some changes. Instead of, for example, the year of the vengeance of our God, he made no reference to vengeance. This is something those people clung to. They wanted the Romans out. They wanted to conquer the Gentiles, bring them into servitude. Jesus said, no, the year of compassion of our Lord, and they took offense. That's how
Yeah.
things turned so fast in Nazareth. But up here in Capernaum, it's probably a more diverse crowd of people, because there were people from all around Tyre and Sidon and some up from Judea to listen to this new rabbi who was so effective in his teaching, thanks in part to the use of parables.
I mean, wasn't one of the quotes of Galilee of the nations, it's often called. So this idea that the historical and biblical term notes the northern part of the region of Israel, but it's also talking about the hub of the nations, this crossroad of the
It was an
nations.
international area, though the
Yeah.
trade routes
Yeah, the
passed right
international
through there,
trade
which
routes
is
were passing right through. Yeah.
probably why Jesus decided to make that his base of operations.
Absolutely. You can take the gospel to the nations, or you can bring the nations to the gospel, and Jesus
Mm,
does both
mm.
by spending his time there in the evangelical triangle. But even these zealous folks, I mean, if you want to talk about zealous or Jewish zealots, he's quoting their book, Isaiah, more than any other. So the count is 23 to 44 quotes estimated from Deuteronomy, 15 to 68 Psalm quotes, and an estimate of 55 quotes from the prophet Isaiah by Jesus. So total, Jesus is quoting the Old Testament quite a bit, and using that and fulfilling that, again, not canceling it out, but bringing it to fruition and pointing out the fulfillment. And so Jesus is trying to connect these dots for these Jewish zealots who sometimes miss the point or just need the reference so that they can get it. And so, here's this Isaiah quote and connecting the parables. Even his family is missing the point. I think it was
Well, they couldn't run home and take out their Bibles and double check him because there weren't. printed Bibles. There were no books per se. There was a limited number of scrolls, usually in the hands of the intellectuals and the scribes and people who ran synagogues and the temple. So
Right.
if they responded to the quote, it's because they knew it
Yeah.
through rote memory.
Mm-hmm.
And Isaiah is often referred to as the fifth gospel. I mean, only second to the land, people call the land the fifth gospel, and they call Isaiah the fifth gospel because there's so many quotes by Jesus. And again, 55, there's, I think, 65 books in Isaiah, chapters, excuse me, but 55 references or quotes there. So it's a pretty hard-hitting book, and this is why Jesus is talking in parables, so that these folks get it. And he wants not just the nation of Israel to get it, he wants the nations to get it.
So the parable of the wheat and the tares.
Yeah.
What's a tare?
Weed.
A
So
weed.
the ESV actually says it's a weed, but the word there is darnel, and this plant actually looks like wheat. The difference is it's missing the fruit or the wheat kernels. So this is a part of why Jesus tells the parable of the wheat and the tares. And they see this like, hey, an enemy has done this because they sow their field, and then there's an enemy that comes at night, sows darnel or sows weed seed amongst the wheat. And as these things are growing up together, they realize like someone has sown darnel, someone has sown weeds in this field. So this is another parable. This parable comes after the parable, the sower that we've been talking about, is explained by Jesus. And then he put another parable before them in verse 24. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. So this sower has done the right thing in the right place. He sowed good seed in good soil. But while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds. So what a mess. Someone comes and sows weed seed amongst your wheat seed. And what happens? An enemy has to do this. And, the issue here, I believe, part of the issue here is when someone sows weed seed, they don't just hurt the person planting wheat. They're hurting everyone who is dependent upon that field of wheat. So it's not just the sower, it's not just the owner of the field, it's the village, the economy that's depending on the field. I'm going to quote Jeremiah here to you, and I know that's a weird jump to go from the parable of the weeds to Jeremiah, but when the people are in exile, God gives the instruction to the prophet Jeremiah. Pray for the city to which you're carried away in exile, because if the city prospers, you will prosper. But I thought the Babylonians were the enemies of the people of God. Why would I pray for my enemies? Why would I cause an enemy city to flourish? And he tells us the answer, because if the city that you're living in flourishes, you flourish. So in this case, this enemy who sows weeds isn't just hurting the sower or the landowner. He's hurting the entire village economy. So the enemy's mission statement, again, to quote John 10:10 and Jesus, the thief comes to kill, steal, and destroy, but I have come, Jesus said, that you might have life and have life abundantly. So the enemy's work here by sowing weed seed in the field is destruction and death and to kill, literally steal from the people, steal from this landowner who is sowing wheat, steal from the economy of the village. So the enemy has plans to do in all the people that he can in mass, which is why, again, he's sowing weed in the entire field amongst this wheat.
And I'm reminded by some of Doug Greenwald's writings again that 90% of the people across Israel in that day and age were dirt poor.
Yeah.
And that it actually took 5 people working in the fields day after day after day after day to feed 6 people over the course of a year. Wow. So they were never more than an insect infestation or a drought away from famine. So tares in the wheat field is not to be taken lightly.
What book did or what work did Doug reference that in? Do you remember?
Oh, in many of them. I mean,
Okay.
it
Yeah. I
comes
mean,
up
an
a number of
agricultural
times.
society, I mean, that's exactly right. So, one bum crop away from a famine here. And then you get like, the story of Joseph and how Joseph saves the Israelite people in Egypt from famine by predicting this drought and storing up grain. So the parable continues. So when the plants came up and bore grain and the weeds appeared also. Now that's an important verse, verse 26, because if weed or darnel looks like the wheat plant, how do you know? And that's the question, right? How do you know? And so it's like this. When the weed grows up with the wheat and the wheat kernels begin to form, the fruit begins to form, the wheat in the chaff, in the head of the grain, the weight of that bows, it bends under the weight. The stalk of the grain bends under the weight of the fruit of the grain. And so the weed, the darnel, that doesn't have wheat kernels in it, stands up tall and strong, almost prideful, and yet the fruitful wheat bows
Well,
under
again,
the
keep
weight.
in mind that there is a spiritual connotation here. It's not all about wheat fields. It's about your heart and
Yeah,
about
it's
the spirit.
fruitfulness.
Yeah.
So you can tell the difference between a weed and a wheat because it will bow humbly under the weight of a fruitful life. And how do you know how to weed out the wheat and the weed from the wheat? Why do you wait for the harvest? Because when they grow up together and one produces fruit and one doesn't, you'll tell by the one that's unfruitful because it will be filled with that pride. And so then you can see to pull it up and root it out. And of course, the weed is burned into the ovens, but the grain is harvested. It's
Except that
dried,
Jesus goes on to say, don't pull up the weeds.
not until the harvest. And
After the harvest, you can make the distinction
right,
because I guess the point is with pulling up the tares would also pull up the wheat.
that's
Well, you
right.
got to wait till harvest time.
And the reason you pull up the wheat with the tares is because you can't tell them apart as much as if you let them grow to maturity. Because again, when they're mature, the weight of the wheat, you can see it. You can say, oh, that's wheat for sure. And this is darnel for sure. We'll weed this out. And then, of course, the weed is thrown into the ovens. So the servant said to the master of the house, came and said to the master, Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have weeds? He said to them, an enemy has done this. Of course, why would I sow weed seed? And if you have a lawn like I do, you don't have to plant those things. They just pop up, those dandelions. You're like, where did that come from? You don't even have to plant them. Of course, you've got enough trouble with weeds without someone sowing weed in your wheat. But here, someone has done this. So the master of the house says, an enemy has done this. So the servant said, do you want us to go and gather them? But he said, no, lest in gathering the weeds, you root up the wheat along with them. Let them both grow together until the harvest. And at the harvest time, I will tell the reapers, gather the weeds first, bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barns.
So what's the message to the people of God, to his disciples, to
Right.
the church in our age?
And is this talking about the church of the world? Right? What is the field here? Is this the people of God? And I would say, yeah, you can see weeds in the church. There are wheat and weeds in the church, or is this the world? Yeah, you can see a whole lot more weeds in the world than in the
Well, I can
church.
see a reference here to both or either. It really doesn't make any difference. I mean,
Yeah.
even Isaiah prophesied for his time, and that political and military and cultural crisis moment, but it applies also to everything hence, including our time.
Here's what I like about the parable. Jesus prayed in John 17. He said, Father, I pray that they may be one as you and I are one. I pray that you don't take them out of the world. This is verse 15 of chapter 17 of John. I do not ask that you take them out of the world, but that you keep them from the evil one. They are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. Sanctify them in your truth. Your word is truth. So can a weed become a wheat? Or, is it that can we wait to the harvest and see who's who and what's what? Because unlike weed and wheat seed, you and I change. We convert. We're born again, right? To quote Jesus' words to Nicodemus, can we move from unfruitful weed to fruitful wheat? And how do we know who's who? And we've got to live in this world with the people in this world.
Who then does the term tares apply to with respect to the church today?
Maybe those at the harvest who indeed do not produce fruit. Because again, this is back to John 17:16. They are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. Sanctify them in your truth. Your word is truth. So in the end, it's those who are sanctified in the truth, those who have received the seed of God's word and produced fruit in their lives. By the way, sandwiched in here is you'll know a tree by its fruit. You'll know a tree by its fruit. So in this series of parables in Matthew's gospel, you get the parables of the prophecy of parables. You get the mustard seed and the leaven. You get the parable of the hidden treasure. You get all these things of value. But even in chapter 12, you'll know a tree by its fruit. And in chapter 7, that happens too. So if you look at Matthew 12, and in 7, there's a parallel passage. A tree is known by its fruit. It says, either make the tree good, Jesus says in 12:33. Make the tree good and its fruit good, or make the tree bad and its tree bad. For the tree is known by its fruit. And you'll know a tree by its fruit. So fruitfulness is the point. We don't want to be a weed in God's harvest field, but we want to bear fruit. And in the end, we'll know, because again, the weed stands high and prideful, and the fruitful bows humbly.
I failed to mention at the beginning, at the very get-go, that Pastor Robbie is also the executive director of Preserving Bible Time. That's the organization I referred to. Doug Greenwald founded it, was the senior teaching fellow there for years and years and years. He has passed, and guess who stepped in to fill his shoes? Pastor Robbie. They're doing a splendid job with the ministry. Preserving Bible Times, their website, preservingbibletimes.org. You can visit there. And if you'd like, sign up for the newsletter. It's called Between the Lines. The whole website, the whole ministry is based upon teaching you how to read the Bible and understand it how the original audience would have understood it, which multiplies the meaning to you. And if you try to apply it to your life, now you have the ammunition to do so. You can read between the lines and see what's really there, what's been there all the time. Doesn't add to the Bible. It amplifies it beautifully. PreservingBibleTimes.org, paid what is it? Robbie, thanks so much. We'll look forward to next week.
Joy, privilege, and a pleasure to be with you on this broken road. Jim and David, thanks for having me on.